I am Nahed Kabbani, and this is the Lighthouse for today's viewers. Welcome to our show. Time is flying. It seems like last week we were talking about 64th anniversary for Palestinians living hard life in Palestine through Israel government. Today we will talk about 65th anniversary, like all of a sudden it comes around the corner. Also, it used to be I bring to the show to educate you, my viewers, American journalist or Palestinian person or somehow somebody knowing, have knowledge about this topic. But today I have surprise for you, and I brought you the best of knowledge for this topic. Our guest today, an Israeli general's son. I mentioned that sometime last year when he visited this country. But today he is visiting us in our studio to tell you his story from his point of view. Let him introduce himself to you. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice
Will
to be
you
here.
please introduce yourself to our viewers?
Sure. My name is MIko Peled. I was born and raised in Israel. My father, as you mentioned, was a general. He was MIko Peled. He was a general during 1967 war, which began yesterday in 1967. And I was raised in a very patriotic Zionist Israeli household, and was raised to believe in the cause of Zionism, in the right of Jewish people to live in the land of Israel. My grandparents immigrated to Palestine because they were pioneers, because they were Zionists. And this was how I viewed, the situation in the world and so on. And so that's my background. Over the years, throughout my life, there were events that shattered that beautiful picture, shattered that beautiful Zionist image of the world and of Israel and of the whole Israeli-Palestinian issue. And gradually, as this was being shattered, I was able to glimpse at this other reality that exists just right next door to me, really, but I was not aware of it as I was growing up. Until eventually the whole thing fell apart. It shattered and broke. And the realization that I came to was that this picture is a myth. It's not true. Not only is there another story and another picture that I was not aware of, but the story that I did grow up on is really a myth. It's a lie. It's not true. So, and then eventually I wrote the book, The General's Son, which relays this entire journey and this entire story.
That's really hard to disappoint it, to find that reality different than the way you understand life or you grow up with. We don't choose our parents, we don't choose our religion also, but we choose to change our mind to do better for our life. And your change mind, what it brought you different than the picture what we hear or the picture Israel built up through?
Well, the story I grew up on and the story that people grew up on here in America is this very romantic story that talks about the Jewish people returning to their homeland, which is an interesting concept because this whole idea that Jewish people are returning as though they just left, 2 weeks ago. And this is how the Zionists tell the story. This is a story that was really put together by the Zionists, saying that the Jewish people in the world today have a right to return to the land of Israel because they are the descendants of the ancient Hebrews. And the ancient Hebrews lived there 2,000-3,000 years ago. And this is a story that has come to be accepted. And because they're the descendants of the ancient Hebrews, they have a right to return. And the idea of return after 2,000-3,000 years is really an interesting idea. And it's interesting that people accepted it. And it's interesting particularly in light of the fact that when we talk about the right of return of Palestinians, for example, the argument is usually that Palestinians don't have a right to return because they left and it was too long ago. So because it was too long ago, 65 years ago, then they should forget. But the Jewish people was 2,000 years ago, but they have a right to remember and to return.
Their memory is better than
I suppose, but this is how the conversation takes place. So it's very strange. But this is how serious people talk about this. So this is the beginning. The beginning is that we have a right, and here we are. We returned, and finally we were able to get the world to recognize our right to live in the land of Israel. And this was symbolized more than anything with the United Nations resolution to partition Palestine in November of 1947 and give the Jewish people their own state in their ancient homeland. Now, as an Israeli learning about this story, it's very interesting because the perspective is that we were willing to compromise and accept only a small portion of the land because they didn't give us all of it. They only gave us most of it. And because we are open-minded and we seek peace, we accepted that.
Generosity.
We were very generous and we accepted that even though we deserve all of it. And this is truly how this is taught and portrayed. And I remember these feelings. I remember learning this and thinking about this. And here we are, the Arabs, of course, rejected it, and they began a war against us, and they wanted to destroy us. This was the War of 1948. And miraculously, because we were smarter and better prepared and so on, we defeated the Arabs, and the Jewish state was established, the state of Israel was established, and here we are today.
Who started the war? 1948?
Well, the Arabs, of course, because they rejected the partition plan, and then they started the attack against the Jewish community. So this is the story.
Okay.
And it's very romantic, and it's very heroic, and it's the kind of story that you don't want to, you don't want to question it because it's so perfect. The Jewish people, and this was only 2 years after the Holocaust, and the revival of the Jewish people in their homeland. It's a very romantic story. And I think this is why it's still holding on. People still hold on to that story, regardless of how many historians have proven it wrong, including Israeli historians. Now, my ability, like I said, this picture began getting shattered over the years. It wasn't one big, it wasn't one thing that made it shatter, but it very gradually cracks began building until it was shattered. And what I found was that, and I think that's a healthy process. I think it's a healthy process when you mature. You examine the things that you were raised upon, and you make sure that they're true, and what is true, what isn't true, what works for you, what doesn't. You examine these things. That's part of being mature. And I found that, to begin with, the whole idea of return is quite absurd. And the fact is most Jews had no interest in returning and didn't think Zionism was much of a good idea. The second part was that this whole idea of the partition plan, which the Zionists saw as a huge accomplishment, was really absurd because there were only about 500,000 Jewish people living in Palestine at the time. Most of them were immigrants like my grandparents and their children like my parents, where there was about 1.5 million Palestinians. So the fact that the United Nations gave the larger portion of the land to the Jews is completely absurd, number one, and it makes perfect sense that the Arabs rejected it. Of course they rejected it. Who wouldn't reject it? They had every right to reject it, and they were right to it. And then when we look at these two communities, how the war began, we see that the Jewish community, though it was smaller, had a very strong militia, whereas the Palestinian Arabs had no military force. So you have to wonder, if they had no military force, how could they begin an attack on the Jewish community? And then it goes from there, and then you realize it wasn't initiated by the Palestinian Arabs, it was initiated by the Zionist militia. They initiated a campaign that was really a campaign of terrorizing and ethnic cleansing that lasted 12 months. from the end of 1947 till the end of 1948. And at the end of that campaign of terrorism, they were able to conquer almost the entire country, destroy hundreds of towns and villages, and force close to 1 million people into exile.
How they use war to have the ethnic cleansing in Palestine through some items or some ideas does that. They left Palestine all of a sudden. How they left, why they left.
Well, the story that the Zionists tell is that after the State of Israel was established in May of 1948, they asked the Arabs to stay. Mm-hmm. But the Arabs left anyway. Mm-hmm. So we begged them to stay, and they left anyway.
Why? Is there any special
Because
reason?
the Arab leaders told them that if they left, they could come back or something. This was the story. The reality is, of course, that this was a campaign of terrorism. It was 12 months where the Zionist militia terrorized the civilian population. Mm-hmm. And caused this mass exile, forced this mass exile of hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million people. But again, the story is so romantic and so perfect, people don't want to question it, mm-hmm. especially when it has to do with you. Like in my family, my father was part of the Zionist militia. He was an officer, you know. My grandfather signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence. You know, it's very difficult to break away from that story when your entire family is part of the story. Mm-hmm. You know, the State of Israel wasn't something abstract to me. It was part of my family. Mm-hmm. So that was the journey, and that's what was revealed to me once this whole thing was fractured.
All the family changed mind, all the kids, or just all you thought?
No, it actually began, it was a gradual process, like I said. Some of it has to do with experiences my mother went through. Some of it has to do with the experience my father went through. Mm-hmm. After he retired from the military, he became a voice for Palestinian rights, mm-hmm. and was part of a dialogue with the PLO when the PLO was considered illegal and you're mm-hmm. not allowed to talk to the PLO and so forth. And then I had my own experiences, and you know that helped me reach these conclusions. And my other brothers and my brother and my sisters also reached similar conclusions. Yes. Mm-hmm. So we share these feelings in my family.
Thank God, God gave us a brain to use, yes. and you used it wisely. And when anybody, now we search about religion, between three religions, what is the, things alike and things. We use our brain. Somehow we use our yes. brain, we dig in, we find things different than what we grew up with. And we use our judgment, our wisdom. And that's what you did, and you did wonderful until now. Hopefully it will give better results. So we'll have a break and we'll be back soon.
You're watching The Lighthouse for today's viewers, brought to you by oneworldforyou.org.
So I hope that opening will let you stay tuned and listen to what we will have from our guest, because it's very important to hear it like first hand. Let's see what he has in his pocket for us. So you realize that, and you find out things not going well and fishy things around you. How it goes from that point?
Well, like I said, there were several stages mm-hmm. along the way that brought about this shattering of this mm-hmm. picture. You know, I'll give you a couple of examples. You know, one example is a story that my mother used to tell me when I was a child. She was born and raised in Jerusalem, and in 1948, when the Palestinian communities in Jerusalem were forced to leave and their homes were taken by the Israeli militia, I'm talking about outside the old city mm-hmm. of Jerusalem, of course. Their homes were given to Israeli families. And she was offered one of these homes. She was already a mother. She was 22 years old, and she was offered one of these homes. And the way she told me the story, my whole life, and I can't remember when was the first time she told me the story, she said, how could I possibly take the home of another family? She was shocked that she was even being offered mm-hmm. a home of another family. And she used to describe how the soldiers came in and looted these homes. And these homes are still there in Jerusalem. They're still standing there. They're some of the most beautiful homes in Jerusalem. The most beautiful neighborhoods. The neighborhoods are still there. And she would describe the looting and how the shame that she felt looking at these other Israelis and behaving in such a way. And how when the soldiers came into the homes, they still found the coffee warm on the table. Mm-hmm. People were just forced to leave. And my whole life, I remember the story in the back of my head, and something about it was very troubling to me. And I couldn't quite figure out, until actually quite recently, relatively speaking, the last few years, that I could understand why the story was so troubling. Because if she was telling the truth, then everybody else's story, the other story, was a lie. Mm-hmm. Because if we were so perfect and the story went the way it was supposed, the way I was told, then what's wrong with taking their house? They left on their own. They attacked us. I mean, we were righteous here. Mm-hmm. We hold the moral high ground. And she told me the story many, many, many times. And again, as I was working on the book, on the General Son, I spoke to her again to hear it again and again and her experience with that. And now, of course, we know that they were. This was corroborated, of course, by Palestinians who told the story, and now by Israeli historians too. So that was one step. Much later on, after my father retired from the military, he retired a year after the '67 war. And he claimed immediately that Israel must make peace with the Palestinians. Otherwise, it will become a binational state. It won't be a democracy. It'll be a brutal occupation. I mean, mm-hmm. Who wants to live like this? He said the best thing we can do is allow the Palestinians their own state. And this is, the 70s and the 80s. These were the years where the idea of the two-state solution came about. Mm-hmm. And then he and several other Israelis created their own little group, and they were contacted by PLO people like Essam Sartawi and Said Hamami and some of these mm-hmm. other voices within the PLO that talked about that. And of course, this was all done with the blessing of Arafat. And they began this dialogue throughout these, the 70s and the 80s, putting together this idea of the two-state solution, which everybody thought would be a good solution. Mm-hmm. Israel, of course, as a government, ignored it completely in the beginning. In the 70s, they ignored it. In the 80s, they passed a law that made these contacts illegal. Mm-hmm. And this was under Shimon Peres as prime minister. And then suddenly in 1993, we had Oslo. Mm-hmm. Rabin was prime minister. Rabin, who was this old war horse, he was, he commanded Israeli forces for a very long time. He was responsible for war crimes beyond belief. And suddenly he wants to meet with Arafat, and he signs this peace agreement. Mm-hmm. And what happened here? This was a very interesting development. And of course, people wanted to believe, many of us wanted to believe that Rabin changed, that now this is a new beginning, and so on. Mm-hmm. But when we actually look at what took place, we could see that between 1967 and 1993, Israel, in fact, integrated the West Bank completely into Israel. Mm-hmm. Giving back the West Bank or creating a Palestinian state in the West Bank was impossible. The conquest was irreversible.
Absolutely.
Through building cities, they say settlements, and it makes it sound like a few little villages, yeah. We're talking about billions of dollars. We're talking about industry and highways and big cities. The West Bank is completely integrated. And by 1993, this was the reality. So the idea of bringing Arafat in and signing the Oslo Peace Accords was not for peace. It was to bring them to surrender under the disguise of peace, which is why it failed. And then, of course, in the year, after that, Rabin was assassinated. The Second Intifada broke out. All these things happened. They tried in the year 2000. Bill Clinton at Camp David tried to bring them all together to close mm-hmm. the deal. And he said he failed. He couldn't. And the reason he couldn't is because the Palestinians wouldn't surrender. Arafat refused to surrender. And I'm sure you remember when they came out of Camp David after almost 3 weeks. Everybody blamed Arafat. Everybody mm-hmm. blamed the Palestinians that they weren't willing to make concessions. Mm-hmm. Clinton said, well, the Palestinians gave some, but the Israelis gave more. Now, if we look at the map, it's clear that this can't be true, because by agreeing to the two-state solution, which means a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinians gave up almost 80% of Palestine mm-hmm. and the rights of the refugees to return. That's not concessions enough? What more does he need to do? And it's obvious that what they wanted him to do was to give up more, to give up completely and surrender. And because he wouldn't, he became the devil. You know, he was vilified, and then he died with Israeli tanks surrounding him in Ramallah. So obviously Israel had no intention of allowing the two-state solution to ever materialize. And they did everything they can to jeopardize that.
In any way, when they talk about states, they create war and they eat some more lands.
Yes.
Then they stop by force from the United Nations and other and withdraw a little bit. But in the meantime, they took that much and withdrew.
Exactly.
And that's why it became a huge area for Israel, little
Yes.
for Palestine. Doesn't make sense.
That's right.
It is sad. The whole story is sad, no matter what. So now, how Israeli people think? What is the solution in their mind, at least? How they will have peace? Can they live this life forever?
Yes, that's the Israeli idea.
Uh-huh.
The Israeli the mindset, the Zionist mindset, the Israeli mindset is that the Arabs hate us no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
We came here and they will never accept us. So we must always be vigilant, we must have a strong army, and we must always fight. There will never be peace. Not with the Palestinians. We can make peace with Jordan, with Egypt maybe, but with the Palestinians, this is how it's going to be. And little by little by little, we will win, and we will force them to surrender. This is a pie in the sky. It's an absurd proposition. 6.5 million Israelis and 6 million Palestinians live within the boundaries of historic Palestine, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Almost by 2020, there will be more than 2 million people in Gaza alone. And even now, they have to rely on tunnels in order to survive. The way the state of Israel conducts itself, it pretends to be a democracy, but it has laws for Jews, Israeli Jews like myself, which are democratic laws, different laws for Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, and then different laws for Palestinians who are in the West Bank and Gaza. In other words, it's a complete apartheid system. And that can't go on. You have 6.5 million Israelis and 6 million Palestinians. That can't continue. It's, besides being immoral and unjust and wrong, it's purely unsustainable. And the question is now, I think, depends on our values. The way people view the solution is really not, it's got nothing to do with politics, but has everything to do with values. Is this reality just the way it is now? A state that is not a democratic state and prefers Jews only? Is that something that we accept? Or do we believe in democracy, in equal rights, in respecting the civil rights of human rights of all people, and therefore we should allow real democracy in all of Palestine, in all of Israel, to exist? A democracy that doesn't, where there isn't, like there aren't different laws for different people, where you don't have this kind of discrimination. If we believe in that, then the solution is staring us in the face. It's a real democracy with equal rights for everyone, regardless of whether they're Palestinians or Israelis.
Yes, you are right.
So it's already a binational state. It's already one state. Now the question is, do we go on like this, like you said, or do we ask for it to become a democracy and end the apartheid?
It's difficult to believe that Palestinians live this miserable life and continue to be quiet and, or supposed to be quiet and have peace with Israel. No matter what Israel will do with the method and ideas, what she brought as military every day they have some problem. Who hate who? No, nobody knows. But it is unusual situation to live together as one state or one area. And as you mentioned, the quantity of people, it doesn't match any reality, any other place in the world. And it is a center for the Holy Land, for the whole world also. It should be in peace. It should be open for all. It should have the best democracy in the world, because God's rules supposed to be there, not military rules.
That's right.
But this is unusual and most difficult. What about the walls? How it goes between those?
Well, I think all of these walls are temporary. I think this reality is completely temporary. I mean, no wall has ever was able to stay forever. Even the Berlin Wall, nobody thought would ever come down. It came down. Apartheid in South Africa, nobody thought would ever end. And many of the anti-apartheid activists that were active with the South African apartheid movement, anti-apartheid movement, are now active with the Palestine anti-apartheid movement. And they will all say the same thing. 1 year before apartheid fell and Nelson Mandela was free, if you said to someone that in 1 year apartheid would fall and Nelson Mandela would be free, they'd think you're crazy. Nobody thought it would happen, not in their lifetime. But these things do happen, and they happen for a reason. They happen because we make them happen. You know, so I encourage activists to stop talking about one state, two state, and all this, and focus on the issue of democracy. It is one state. It's done. What's important now is to make this one state a democracy with equal rights. And then if we all do focus on that, and we all do act to achieve that and talk about that, then that's what will happen. It's inevitable.
I cannot say no, because the two sides will never be balanced. The Arab world and Arab help for Palestinian is zero, and Israel with their military, with the whole world behind them, is very high and very strong, and no equality at all with military side. So how can we have equality in life, in real life, or fight that situation? Fight will not bring any successful story.
That's right.
But better rules, as you mentioned, democracy will make it happen peacefully as a human being. We have rights for humans, and we have to help those people to fight for their rights, all kind of rights, right of return, rights to living better life as a human being, because as American, we are human rights fighters for the whole world. How come this side of the world not including?
That's right.
So anyway, we'll have a break, and we'll be back soon.
OneWorldForYou.org, promoting cultural understanding through the media.
So we heard about the situation. We understand a little bit more about how Israeli and Palestinian live together. Hardly to believe that there is democracy in Palestine or will be happen soon. We'll ask our guest what is his opinion about to change this situation. So how you think, in your point of view, we can do to switch that or change this situation from what we have now to real democracy, to live happily all together?
Well, there are several forces that are already working on this. When people think of resistance, they think of war or people throwing rocks. But in this context, the resistance is much more diverse. If we take a look at what has been happening here in the U.S. over the last 5-6 years, there's been tremendous change. On campuses, you have groups like Students for Justice in Palestine. It started, there were a handful of campuses with, now over the last 5-6 years, there are over 100, 150 campuses in the US and in Canada of students who advocate for the pro-Palestinian cause. And they do tremendous work. Thousands of students come to their events. Thousands of students are exposed to this other story of Palestine. The same thing with the Muslim student groups as well. They organize events, pro-Palestine events, apartheid events, and they educate. We have major churches in America that are taking a new look, a new approach on this whole issue of Palestine, because they visit the Holy Land and they're faced with a reality that can't be hidden. They go to Bethlehem, they go to the settlements, and they see what is going on. They see that it's clearly an unacceptable situation. So they're beginning to change. They're bringing in people with views like myself that are clearly anti-Zionist views to speak to them. You've got the BDS movement, the movement to boycott, divest, and impose sanctions on Israel that's growing. It's becoming stronger. It's part of the conversation. Major performers pull away and won't perform in Israel. Israeli academics are finding it harder and harder to travel and to speak around the world and to get positions around the world. Israeli diplomats in Europe are pulling their hairs because they're dealing with so much anti-Israeli sentiment and pro-Palestinian sentiment, because people are realizing that this is unacceptable. So there's a big change in public opinion, even here in America, where the impression is that all Jews support Israel and all Americans support Israel. It's not true. I see many Jewish people who support the Palestinian cause. Even on campuses, very often the Students for Justice in Palestine, many of those students are American Jews who support the Palestinian cause. So it's not true that all Jews in America support Israel. And little by little, people are being exposed to this reality. People are realizing that the claim that there's a claim, if you criticize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. Well, what about all the Jews that criticize Israel? What about all the Jews that oppose Zionism and always have opposed Zionism? Are they also anti-Semitic? I mean, it's an absurd proposition.
Can you explain that point, anti-Semitic?
Yes,
they throw it away like nothing.
They throw it out there. They throw it out there saying that if you criticize Israel, then you must be anti-Semitic, you must be racist, and so on.
Racist for what? We are the same family.
Well, exactly. To begin with, we're the same race. Number two, what does that even mean? So if you support Israel, then what? You're a super Jew? I mean, it's such a silly argument. Now, the thing is, people are realizing if you do support Israel, then you support a state that has thousands of political prisoners, Palestinian prisoners. You're supporting a state that has different laws for different people based on if they're Jewish or not. So they discriminate against the non-Jewish population. And it's a state that on a regular basis, bombs Gaza and other places and knows they're killing civilians. So supporting that is good and opposing that is anti-Semitic. I mean, it's such an absurd idea, and people are coming to terms with the fact that it's absurd. Many non-Jews are afraid to criticize Israel because they're afraid their Jewish friends will be insulted. Well, they won't be insulted. More Jews are realizing that this is not a Jewish thing. This whole Zionist idea is not a Jewish thing. And there's nothing anti-Semitic about criticizing Israel, and more people are criticizing Israel. So there's been a big shift. And it's becoming unpopular, like I said, to do business with Israel, to perform in Israel, to invite Israelis, and so on. So there are things that are changing, and people are looking at the model of how the struggle against apartheid in South Africa took place and are applying the exact same things. And people forget that there was a strong opposition to fighting apartheid in South Africa. American corporations and businesses and people supported South Africa. And it was a tough battle to fight here, to fight against apartheid in South Africa, very similar to the way it is difficult to fight apartheid in Palestine. But there are big changes taking place. On the ground, Israeli and Palestinian societies are actually very similar. To integrate those two societies is actually very easy. To begin with, most Israelis are the children and grandchildren of Jews who came from Arab countries. They like to call them Sephardic Jews, as though they came from Spain. But they didn't come from Spain, they're Arab Jews.
Does they have the same rights with Israeli, those Jews?
Today they do. When they came, it was very different because they were Arabs.
Yeah,
when they came, it was a big problem, but there was a lot of discrimination. But today it's changed. But what's interesting is that these children and grandchildren of these people who came from Arab countries, they speak and understand Arabic quite often. Even the second, third generation very often speak and understand Arabic. Or if they don't, their parents do. And they will still tell you, we're Moroccans, we're Iraqis, we're Yemenites. To this day, they take pride in that connection.
Because Jews is religion and goes everywhere, like Muslim, like Christianity. Judaism is religion. They mix it with nationality to make it big issue, not to be separate.
Yes, and this is the Zionist idea, but most Jews never accepted it. It's only there's only this myth that Jews have accepted it. Most Jews have never accepted this idea of Zionism that says exactly that. And besides, education levels are very similar. Even in Gaza, education levels are over 90% literacy rates and so on. So it's not like you have one community that's educated and one community that's not. You have two educated that are highly professional, highly educated, and are ready to go, and they could and given the opportunity, given a real equal rights, given a real democracy, they could create a very positive, very productive democracy, functioning democracy, very, very easily. And I would argue that if an Israeli and a Palestinian had to vote, most of them would vote for whoever gave them, low taxes and good schools and good roads, as opposed to voting on ethnic lines. Some people will, but the majority of people are they want to live a normal life, and so they would go with whatever suits their interests, and most of their interests are the same interests.
Absolutely.
And both societies, of course, have a radical, religious element, and both societies have a very corrupt elite that they hate and they want to get rid of course. So there are a lot of similarities, and they could actually form a very perfect democracy, but they need to have that opportunity. That needs to be the conversation. That needs to be the push for a real democracy with equal rights, so that so this potential can materialize. And that's exactly the process that I believe is taking place already.
One point I like you to explain it. Jews establish their state under the right of return and God's giving and God's order. In the name of God, is God accepting this kind of fighting, killing, and things under the name of God to take the land, to steal land, and say, under God's rules?
Yeah, I don't think God has anything to do with Zionism. The Zionists were completely, they weren't religious people. They didn't believe.
When you talk about religion, that means you behave different way with God.
Yeah.
You don't kill for God's sake because of the land.
That's right.
The two ideas will not go together at all.
That's right.
So Israel built up of stories cannot make sense, and they give it to the world. The world will not argue. They accept what they have. But in reality, how to balance, to have, after all, to seek peace, or to have something in common to lead you to peace.
Yeah.
Otherwise, those ideas are so hard to believe, so hard to live with. But at least you have an idea from inside how to deal with that.
Yeah, I think it's very important to keep God out of the story and keep it political, and make sure that people understand that there is no big difference between Jews and Muslims, and there is no conflict between Jews and Muslims. In fact, there never was a conflict. Jews lived very well in Muslim countries for generations.
Never asked about religion.
Both in Palestine and in Iraq and in Yemen and
Yes.
in Syria and in North Africa. So that is not the issue. The issue that the Zionists created this wedge between the two people. And this is the problem. The problems began with Zionism, and I will argue that they will end when Zionism disappears, just like apartheid in South Africa disappeared. And when that happens, then people will see that that is not the issue. There is no, people talk about Judeo-Christian values. I would argue that the Judeo-Muslim values are much closer, actually, because the two religions are very, very close. So that is not the problem.
It's not two religion to me.
Yeah.
The real
Sister
religion is the Judaism for the whole world. We all supposed to be Jews, and that's God's message. And Islam is not something new totally. It's repeated the same rules. Christianity came for mercy and love and peace, but Islam repeat exactly the first method, the same, because we all believe in one God. And it's not a new religion to compare it. The same rules, exactly, except little touches between the different thousands of years and what it needs this time. But that's why they are too close. Supposedly one religion and one God.
Yeah.
And nothing supposed to be between both except doing better for God as a human being. So I agree with you that there's a lot
in common.
Things in common, more than things in differences.
Yeah.
The differences is the politics and the rights.
Yes.
That's all.
Yes. And the sad thing is the Zionists tried to destroy all this beautiful history that existed in Palestine while it was an Arab country. Palestine was an Arab country for 1,500 years. They're trying to destroy it and only make relevant what happened 3,000 years ago. That's during the ancient Hebrews. Nothing else is relevant, which is very sad, because there's a rich history and a rich culture that exists, an Arab and Muslim and kind of a joint culture, if you will, in Palestine, and it's very sad to see it being destroyed.
One more point, maybe to clear it up. The Holocaust uh, Jewish people think that they got the Holocaust and get hurt through that. That's why they came to Palestine and hurt people. When I ask this question, does the Palestinian people does that Holocaust for you? No, but we get hurt and we turn to the other person close to us. It doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense, and it's not even true, because the reality is that the vast majority of Holocaust survivors did not go to Palestine. You know, if we look at Jews in Europe before Hitler, during Hitler, and after the war, very few came to Palestine. You know, they were welcome to come to Palestine. Of course, there were restrictions by the British, but they were very welcome. You know, after the war, there were about 2 million Jews living in internment camps after World War II. Only about 150,000 went to Palestine. The vast majority either stayed in Europe, even in Germany, or came to America, and it was very hard to come to America. America didn't want the Jews, and they were turning them back, but they were insisting to come to America. So it's not true that the Jews turned around and then, with their suffering, and then made somebody else suffer. These are not the same people. The Zionists are not the same people as the people who suffered the Holocaust. The Zionists were there before the Holocaust. The plan to ethnically cleanse Palestine came about before the Holocaust, and the two are really not connected in that way. So I think it's wrong to implicate all Jews with the crimes of Zionism.
That's okay, that's right. At least to clear it up for the viewers. There's a lot of questions when we listen to the story, things in mind, nobody can answer the questions. So we'll open the last part in our show for questions for our viewers. So we'll be back soon with questions and answers. We'll have this part for questions and answers because there is a lot like to know from our guests. So we have in our studio Miss Alison Weir, an American journalist, and she was with us so many times in our show covering this subject. Now she will ask some questions to give us more information for her and us. And Miss Alison, will you please?
Thank you for letting me have this chance. It's just such a fascinating and uplifting story. And by the way, MIko, I met your sister, Nurit, in Palestine. She gave a very interesting talk about the Israeli educational system and how much it pushes militarism at all ages in the Israeli schools. So it was very interesting. I guess there's so many questions I'd like to ask you. One of them is a question that people ask me a lot. What has happened now that you're speaking out so publicly about this? You've written this very powerful book. Have you had attacks? Have you had people trying to discredit you, calling you? I do have some Jewish friends who get called anti-Semitic or self-hating. Has that happened to you? Have there been efforts to try to diminish your effectiveness or water down what you're saying?
No, I have to say there haven't been any attacks. There haven't. I mean, from time to time I get an email that's not very pleasant, but there's really nothing. It's very rare that I get interrupted during my lectures or that people come and say anything. It's very, very rare. I can't say it doesn't happen at all, but it's a rare occasion that anything happens. What they say behind my back, I don't know, but to my face, nothing. No, nothing at all.
And then sort of a follow-up is, have you had an opportunity to speak to audiences who come into the room thinking that they oppose you? Maybe speaking at synagogues, or have you spoken in any synagogues, or have you been invited to speak in any Hillel programs on campuses?
No. Yeah, no, the Zionist community doesn't want to hear what I have to say. And so only in as much as they might send somebody to a talk and they will record or something like this, but they're not really interested in a conversation about this issue. Anything that goes beyond that, very, very small and narrow existence of Zionism is taboo. And so if they do come to my lectures, and from time to time, the Zionist groups, Hillel or somebody might send a representative, they don't want to engage in a conversation. They want to give a counter lecture. Mm-hmm. So they'll come up sometimes, and again, it doesn't happen often, but they'll come up and they'll try to they want equal time. And I was at UC Irvine, and I said to them, you don't get equal time. You can ask a question, and then you have to go home, and you're not going to like my answer, and you have to live with that. But obviously they don't invite me because they don't want to have this conversation. The conversation that goes beyond the boundaries of Zionism is something that they don't dare have, because it's very dangerous. Once you go beyond Zionism, you might see something different, and that's not acceptable. It's a very narrow-minded, very myopic point of view.
Then I'm also curious about your own journey that's so interesting. Your mother clearly made such a strong statement, and that's, to me, that's very young, 21 or 22, to be able to see how wrong that was, instead of like, wow, I get a house handed to me. But just knowing that, being outraged at that is really a wonderful thing. But so I'm wondering, and then your father, having served in 1948 and then again in 1967, and I'm wondering, then began to question certainly the occupation and feeling that was deeply wrong, I'm sure on many levels. Nevertheless, you went into the military. I'm surprised, did they try to suggest that you not do that, or was there still sort of a real conflict in people's in your family about being loyal Israelis and yet being opposed to policies? Was there a discussion when you decided to join the military?
I had some doubts on whether or not I wanted to join the military, but the reasons to join were overwhelmingly greater than the reasons to refuse. This was still, we were all still living in the Zionist reality. In other words, the Zionist paradigm was part of what we talked about. Yes, there were mistakes made. Yes, we need to allow the Palestinians rights. We need to recognize their right to self-determination, but not that there was anything, but fundamentally Zionism was the right thing. Everything had to be done within the Zionist framework. Now, I know this is going to might sound a little strange, but if I knew then what I know now about what was going on then, and I was in the military from 80 to 83. I know it's a mandatory draft. I would have refused. And it's interesting. People often say, "How did you not know with your father and all this?" But the reality is, I didn't know. I knew what I knew, and I knew that there were mistakes, but I still knew it was my duty to do the right thing, and I was going to serve. And I have a chapter in the book called The Red Beret, talking about the military service, describing the military service and the process I went through in being in it and realizing what it was all about. Being told to march up and down a Palestinian town and to break the bones of anybody who looks at me. And I was thinking, how everybody's going to look at us? We're fully armed soldiers walking up and down in the middle of a street. What kind of a crazy idea is this? And why are they giving us handcuffs and batons? We're infantry soldiers. We should be training to fight wars against armies, not this. So that was part of the process of my kind of realizing that something here was inherently wrong and breaking away from within the Zionist framework of thinking. But there was no real discussion on whether or not I should. Although, like I said, I did have some doubts, but the reasons, like I said, to join were overwhelmingly greater than the reasons to refuse.
And then that sort of leads to the trying to understand the Israeli public, which of course is diverse, but that I'm curious about. On the one hand, I do feel that when I meet people, often they do seem to not be very informed about what's going on in the occupied territories or the number of Palestinian children who have been killed, etc. And yet, a very high percentage of Israeli citizens have served in the military. They themselves have served, or certainly their spouse or their partner or have served there. And here you're describing what you saw in the early 80s. Of course, people see the same type of thing now. So, how could they not know? I guess I'm trying to understand, do they know, or do they not know, or do they just try to not think about what they've seen? Or, what's going on?
They do know. There's no question the Israelis know, but they justify it to a degree where it blocks their ability to analyze and to have a real clear view of the reality. Israelis, to a large degree, as much as you can generalize, and I think on this issue you can generalize, because Israelis are deeply ingrained and deeply believe in the righteousness of the Zionist cause and this whole Zionist framework. That they have a right to live there, the Arabs will always hate us, we might always have to fight, but you know what, maybe we can do something. At the same time, when they called the reservists for the attack in Gaza at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009, what they call Cast Lead, that massive assault against Gaza, there was 100%, the reservists all showed up. I mean, everybody was eager to fight, and everybody believed in the cause, and so on. So they do see what they're doing, but they completely justify it. And of course, you have some voices that come up, like refuseniks, people who refuse to serve, or breaking the silence, and so forth, who just can't take it anymore and are out there and giving testimony to what they did and what they saw. But of course, these are very small groups. But Israelis know, and they believe that this is the right thing to do, and they believe it's part of the Israeli experience. It's one of those things. Yes, it's one of those things where they say, "Well, it's a terrible thing to do, but you have to do it." I mean, there's no choice, as though there is no choice, because as long as the conversation is bound by the Zionist idea and can't expand beyond it, that's all you see. All you can do is justify. I mean, probably the most, maybe the most fundamental experience as an Israeli is the story of 1948. And everything after that is a repetition of that. Not all of us lived in 1948, obviously, but we wish we did, because that was such an important experience in creating the Israeli identity. Well, if you are willing to accept that the 1948 was really nothing more than a massive act of terrorism that lasted 12 months and was conducted by an armed militia against a civilian population, what does that now say about this Israeli identity? This is very hard to accept. I mean, I talk about this now quite freely. The process of realizing this and going through this is terribly painful. I mean, it's terribly, terribly painful. It's physically painful. And most people don't want to go through it. And again, like I said, everybody wants to imagine that they lived in 1948, and what they do now when they go into Gaza is really a repetition of that or an extension of that. And that's why Israelis can do this, see it, and then justify it, or deny that it was actually as bad as people say it was.
It's interesting that you do look at 1948. So many activists who grew up with a strong Zionist conditioning would rather just go to 1967.
Yes.
That was the first time that there was anything sort of impure or unjust in the Israeli system.
Yes.
And the fact that you go, and as some did, I mean, I've been interested to see some very important literary figures, I think in the 50s, were writing about what had gone on in very powerful terms. But still, it seems like a tiny number of people that are willing to do that. So it's interesting. Did your father ever, do you think, go that far?
No, absolutely not. His point of view, his perspective was, and the perspective of that group of people who are inherently Zionists, but they wanted to find a solution within the two-state framework. They said, well, we're not going to look at the past. We're not going to look at 48. What happened. Now there's no reality. We have to make peace, and this is what we're going to do. But I think one of the problems with this, with the talking about the 1967 or the West Bank as occupied territories, is that it creates the impression that only the West Bank and Gaza is Palestine, that only the West Bank and Gaza are occupied territories, and nobody dares to say all of Israel is occupied Palestine, all Israeli cities are illegal settlements. They say, oh, they built illegally in the West Bank, so building in Tel Aviv on the ruins of Palestinian towns is not illegal. So I think it's very important for us as activists in the activist community to stop saying illegal settlements here, because that means that they are legal over there. There is no difference, and Israelis have said it from the very beginning. There's no difference between, Ma'ale Adumim and Tel Aviv, which means it's all the same. They're all illegal. It's all Palestine, and therefore it all has to change. Zionism has to go. It's not just a little bit of Zionism has to go, you know. But you're absolutely right. Israelis don't want to go back that far because, again, it goes beyond that realm or beyond the boundaries of Zionism, and nobody wants to go that far.
Because whatever they take land, it becomes their own.
Yes.
And they give little bit from that land because of the word push that hard.
Yes.
That's why they are generous to give
Yes,
back,
exactly.
but not Palestinian land. It's their own now.
That's right.
So anyway, the time is always running fast when we need it. And thank you, Elsa, for this introduction and questions, because you cover the needs for our viewers too to know more and more about this subject. Really, I appreciate your being with us today. And I cannot thank you enough for this time, and hopefully we'll see you more and more.
Thank
and
you.
Maybe we'll plan a show for you to be continuously giving information to our viewers, because in my opinion, if American people didn't know the truth, they cannot solve the problem. We need peace. How we will create peace if we don't know the situation?
That's right.
No matter what we will do, we'll be missing part, the Palestinian rights.
Yes.
If we know what's going on, American people will be doing better job solving the problem. And that's my intention through bringing that story to the viewers and educate people more and more about the subject, because they don't know. And when they don't know, they don't know.
And they give a lot of money. They should know.
Now, they don't know behind that. Now you are giving
Yes.
different story, and Edison
Yes.
was helping me too
Yes.
through that subject. And really, I guess our guests have an idea now, and they might search more about the subject. Again, on behalf of my viewers and my audience, I thank you very much for coming to our show, and hopefully we'll see you some other time.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And for you, my viewers, I hope that we gave you some kind of information, shed some light about this hard topic, and hopefully you benefit from that. And we'll see you some other time with other shows and continue sharing with you some ideas to help you to go through. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.